Apothecaries make up the medical scientists of the Space Marines, and they do fill a few different roles besides just being combat medics and field surgeons. And that is what we're covering today, the Apothecary Biologis, which is in more ways a battlefield researcher rather than a direct medic, often studying their enemies to more effectively take them down both in battle, as well as knowing their strategies better. Hello everybody, my name is Spoons Rattling, and welcome to another video. So the Apothecary Biologist comes in at 55 points, so he's rather cheap. He has a standard Gravis stat line of 5 inches of movement, toughness 6, a 3+ save, 5 wounds, and leadership 6+, with OC 1. In terms of ranged weapons, he just has an Absolver Bolt pistol, which is 18-inch range, with 1 attack that hits on 3s, at strength 5, AP 1, and damage 2. This is a solid enough weapon, if nothing standout. It's just nice for shooting an infantry to death or two, and you likely won't forget it just because it is a very solid profile. He doesn't really have a melee weapon, just a close combat weapon, which is of course just 5 attacks that hit on 3s at strength 4, AP 0, and damage 1, so he hits like a wet napkin in melee combat, which is not great. However, he does get a lot of value from his leader ability, unsurprisingly, which his main leader ability is very similar to that of the lieutenants of the Space Marines, being when he's leading a unit, weapons in that unit gain lethal hits. Now, lethal hits is huge for a lot of weapons, especially mid-strength ones. It also applies to melee and at range, which is super useful. Given his Gravis armor, he's going to be often rocking on the front line, trying to weather a lot of damage, so getting in melee isn't unlikely. And then his secondary ability is his Vivispectrum, the thing in his other hand, which is after an enemy unit has been destroyed in combat by this unit, increase this model's OC characteristic to 9. Now this is surprisingly not the most impactful, but when it happens it can be very useful to flip the relatively low OC of Gravis units to very high, obviously because you just gained extra 9 AC, which is equivalent to 4 or 5 bodies of standard battle line. In terms of overall stats, though, his core stats are very good, his damage is very bad, but his abilities are very solid for only 55 points. So that's an interesting dilemma for a character where his stat line doesn't bring much, but his abilities do. In terms of leader options, he has 3. So with heavy intercessors, they generally prefer being a little cheap and tough, just to sit on a field objective, a backfield objective, and plinking away with their long-range weaponry. Of course, if you do want them to do damage, this is probably your best bet, just given their lack of melee options, and their mid-strength weaponry will really appreciate the lethal hits, but I'd only do that if you're playing something like Anvil Siege Force or something similar. Eradicators are actually interesting because despite the fact that they have melta weapons, they actually really enjoyed this guy, and even with all the rerolls, just having those extra auto wounds is going to greatly improve their consistency with dealing with tanks, which is of course their main target. 3 Eradicators with this guy is a good way to fill up something like a Land Raider that may already have, say, a unit of Blade Guard inside of it. And then the main claim to fame, why most people know this guy for his combos, is the Aggressors. Now the Aggressors have a blend of both melee and shooting, but the main thing you get with them is their shooting. At close range they get that extra AP, they've got a lot of shots, twin-linked, and up close they're really good at shooting things, and with this guy they're really good at shooting everything, not just infantry. And they will still hit pretty hard in melee, though they definitely do want to ride to get to melee, as they will be very vulnerable to things like plasma guns, or anything damage 3, like autocannons will make short work of these guys. But if you do have that, then it's very easy to just get them to the front line, have them shoot something to death, and then charge something and pummel it to death, and in that time you probably will have made a good amount of your points back, just based on the sheer power of Fire Discipline and Gladius, plus Storm of Fire for the extra AP, just to make them really efficient, and especially with Oath of Moment, which you obviously will want to use with them. And as I mentioned, he is at his best with Fire Discipline, and even outside of the combo himself, Gladius has a lot of nice benefits. The extra speed is just always appreciated. In terms of Anvil, I'd say he's pretty solid there. Battle Drill Recall can fulfill a similar role to Fire Discipline and Storm of Fire, but I'd say it's obviously more restricted because you have to stand still, but then you're also getting +1 to wound, which does add some interesting options. In terms of Iron Storm, I don't think he has much use there. This guy is more like the first piece of a buff, which then wants to have 2 or even 3 more buffs on top of it, so nothing too interesting there. In terms of Firestorm, Aggressors are really good in Firestorm, but they're used with their Flamestorm gauntlets, not their Boltstorm gauntlets, so lethal hits is completely moot on them, so there's really no point in bringing him in Firestorm. Stormlance is generally more melee focused, and this guy, while he does buff Aggressor's melee, they generally need to use both their ranged and their melee to good effect, and without extra buffs, their range damage is just going to be sort of good against light infantry, but nothing else, even with the lethal hits. So I wouldn't say they're really at home in Stormlance, though it's not awful. And then in Vanguard, Strike from the Shadows is actually a pretty useful stratagem for these guys. Getting to hit on 2s with the extra AP, especially if it's the closest target, would be nice, but that does require a lot more sort of positioning and, a lot of extra work to get a similar effect that you can just get with running Gladius. And First Company sucks. He can't lead veterans, so he has no benefits there. Don't run him in First Company, and don't run First Company in general. In terms of his best detachments, I'd say probably Gladius is far and away the best, and then probably followed by Anvil, and maybe Vanguard. I could see some interesting things in Vanguard. But yeah, Gladius easily his best spot where he really wants to be and do that big fire discipline combo, which is definitely worth the points. It's very, very powerful. It's always fun to see how people make bolters really powerful in each and every edition, and this is the guy to do it in this edition. Well, he doesn't fill the typical archetype of the medic. He does function more like a lieutenant. That is one thing to keep in mind, which fits their lore. These are battlefield researchers, not medics or surgeons. He is very interesting and a master classic character design, I think. Because compare this guy to the Blade Guard Ancient, who is very similar in that their damage is bad. Both of them have bad damage, but his buffs aren't worth bringing, but his certainly are. And it has to do with, a lot of things. What buffs they bring, how consistent they are, and what targets they can be put on. And with that, I do want to talk about how this guy wants to combo buffs. And the main thing you want to get with him is 5+ critical hits, though extra AP is also very useful to have if you can get it. As I mentioned, he pairs well with Eradicators very well. Honestly, using Fire Discipline with them is not something I would consider, but I don't think would be bad just for the 5+ critical hits. Which is a fine thing to have when you have these huge damage weapons like Melta weapons. Overall, very solid option alongside either, though his other rule is more situational, let's say, though in certain situations it can be very powerful, especially if you're fighting something like Knights, who tend to have rather flat OC. Just this guy alone and then a couple of his buddies will be able to swipe objectives fairly well. And, of course, as I mentioned, damage buffs very good. His leader options pretty solid with Eradicators or Aggressors. And on the whole, for the price point, I don't think you can beat him. He's really solid. His model's really sick, though it does suck that he's stuck in that big box set. I think he's pretty expensive on eBay as well. Anyways, I've been Spoons Rattling. I hope you enjoyed this video. Make sure to like, comment, and subscribe, and I will see you all next time.